this topic now. Joining me is Daniel Kreeger. He's the Executive Director and Co-founder of the Association of Climate Change Officers. Thanks so much for your time there. Now, what do you think are the most pressing issues for our environment on this Earth Day? Of course, we heard about flooding around New York, but for you, what do you think is the most pressing issue?
Well, in the long term, the big ticket is climate change. Unfortunately, we have a variety of environmental challenges, some of which are happening in parallel to climate change. We're using too much materials. We have substantial impacts on the ocean environment. Some of those impacts are from pollution. Some of those impacts are from climate change itself and ocean acidification. The reality is that we've got to figure out a way to have the kind of comforts and productivity that we want to have in society without destroying the environment that sustains us.
Now, we heard recently about a team of scientists funded by NASA, actually, and the European Space Agency that produced a report saying that over the past 3 decades, researchers have found that the rate of ice loss from Greenland has increased 7-fold, and just in 2019 alone shed 44 billion tonnes of ice. What does this mean for coastal communities and cities? Just contextualise the human cost.
Yeah, well, I live in South Florida. We just had 20 inches of rainfall last week. My entire community was underwater, and a number of people are still hammered by that. Now, volume of water that much coming from the sky would be a problem anywhere, but with sea levels inching higher and higher, there's nowhere for that water to go. So in a coastal community like ours, the impacts of that are devastating. So we're getting hit on multiple fronts. We're getting these more extreme downpours. The water level adjacent to coastline is higher in tidal communities, and the combination of those things is in the long run a devastating thing. In the short run, it's already a problem.
From what I understand, the original Earth Day in 1970 was an exuberant, urgent and bipartisan event. Even President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency and signed the Clean Water Act. 2 years later, Congress passed, the Clean Air Act, and Congress passed the Clean Water Act 2 years later. But since then, Earth Day has sort of devolved into a distracted and divided partisan issue. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think if you look in the U.S., the legacy of environmental action in the U.S. going back into the 70s really centers around toxic impacts. And so you see the Clean Air Act, you see the Toxic Substances Control Act, and you see the Clean Water Act. And really what you're looking at there is compromised systems because of pollution, right? Whether it's pesticides or chemicals or air pollution. Climate change is a different animal, and this has become highly politicized, and in some parts of the world, that's because there are communities who are disproportionately contributing to this by way of their economies, and disproportionately impacted, not just in terms of the effects of climate change, but the solutions that we would consider. So if you take communities, for example, whose economies are entirely based on fossil fuels, there's a very difficult conversation that we need to reconcile here about how are we going to not only transition to a cleaner economy, but one in which those people who've been working in those industries are going to be able to be viable.
Daniel Kreeger, thanks so much for your insight. Executive Director and Co-founder of the Association on Climate Change Officers.